It's a good thing that the church can regulate itself and that the state does not necessarily impose its laws upon the church. And here we have to go back to the very fundamentals of what marriage is, marriage as defined in English law, in fact. And it's that unique institution which celebrates difference, the difference between a man and a woman.
Andrea Williams, barrister and CEO of Christian Concern, welcome to The Way.
It's good to be with you.
Over the past 10 years, we've seen an increase in the discrimination of Christians in the workplace. Now, do you believe this is as a result of public attitude changing towards Christians, or perhaps legislation being infiltrated by government?
I think in many ways it is a reflection of where we're at as a society, but it really is because at the heart of our systems, at the heart of the robes of culture,
yes,
at the heart of the education system in our academies and the universities, at the heart of our legislature in Parliament, at the heart of our courts, we have turned our backs on God.
That's true.
And as a result of that, what we end up with is legislation that is counter to God's purposes. We end up with a media, a church, a media that is often speaks counter to God's purposes, but also a church that loses her voice, that becomes increasingly mute in an increasingly hostile situation, hostile culture. And as we become mute, so the prevailing culture becomes stronger, finds more of a voice. And what we've seen in recent years is legislation called equality legislation, equality and diversity legislation, which has in effect created a Christian bar to office, a religious bar to office.
That's right. Now tell us a little bit about this legislation. You've talked before about equal legislation that's infiltrated into our courts. How has the increase of this legislation caused there to be a discrimination against Christians in the workplace? Could you give us a few examples of that?
Well, the legislation comes as a result of, in a sense, Christians not standing for truth in the public sphere.
Yes.
In terms of a nation turning her back on God's fundamental precepts. So when we abandon marriage as a core part of our law, marriage as between a man and a woman, when we begin to legislate for other norms, so when same-sex partnerships become equivalent to heterosexual marriage, and then redefine family so that same-sex civil partnerships can also foster and adopt children, when you then have the wholesale redefinition of family, you then have equality legislation which enshrines and protects those things as norms. If you then disagree with those things, you find yourself out in the cold. You find yourself in trouble with the law. So what do we have? We have magistrates who do not want to place children with a mum and a mum and a dad and a dad. They find themselves removed from the family bench. We have senior paediatricians who simply want to abstain when placing children on an adoption panel, when placing children with two mums or two dads. We find that they're removed from an adoption panel. We find civil registrars who simply want to be rostered off when civil partnerships, when a same-sex civil partnership might take place. We then find that they are without a job. We find social workers who do not want to place children with two mums or two dads. We find that they have to move departments or they lose their jobs. So there's an incredible climate of fear. And these are all cases that are on our books at the Christian Legal Centre. So these are for real. Now these are the ones that perhaps hit the headlines. These are the ones that we're dealing with. What saddens me is that as I travel around the country, I will go to places and I find that I've arrived too late. I find that people will say to me, I was a magistrate, I was a family magistrate, but felt that I could not continue in good conscience. I was a social worker, but found that I could not continue in good conscience. So what we find in effect is that Christians are scared and they're leaving the public space. And indeed now, if they want to access the public space, if they want to become a civil registrar, if they want to become a social worker, if they want to become a foster carer, they want to become, well, they either have to leave their faith at the door, which true Christians surely cannot. Surely cannot.
Yeah.
That's a massive compromise, is it not?
It is.
To simply leave your faith at the door. That's what the state wants, you see. The state wants us to say your faith is private. Take it off. Take it off when you step out. When you step out of the door in the morning, take it off. When you do your job, take off your faith.
So completely unfair. We're in a generation where we're actually seeing Christians being sidelined from society, being sidelined in the workplace. Has the governmental legislation that's come out and EU legislation, does that actually restrict what the courts are allowed to decide at the end of the day?
Well, I think what we've seen is, in truth, is that when the legislation was going through Parliament, when this equalities legislation was going through Parliament under the Blair and Brown government, that many promises were made, and as well as not being able to discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation, which is where the rub is on a lot of these things, we're also not supposed to discriminate on the grounds of religion. But where there is a conflict of rights, between where the two rights clash, so when the Christian conscience clashes with sexual orientation rights, we've found that sexual orientation rights trump the Christians' rights. And we at the Christian Legal Centre have taken our cases all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and strangely perhaps, it's there we hope that we're going to get some redress. It's there we hope that we're going to get some balance, that they will see that in all of the situations that we bring before them and in the situations of our cases, that if there had been some reasonable accommodation of both views, the Christian, in every case that we have, the Christian could have been accommodated properly, could have been rostered off if necessary. In every single case, no homosexual need to have been denied a service.
Or given it to someone else who can perhaps do...
That's exactly
it. Exactly.
That's exactly it. So all of that could have happened.
It's sad to see that this is happening in Britain, where we're Christians, we're a part of a society, and yet our rights are not respected. Do you feel as though the church has taken a back seat, though, that they haven't stood up for their beliefs, and through their complacency, we've seen the infiltration of this legislation? Is it inevitably a result of what the church has not done?
Well, you know, at the end of the day, who's God got? Who's God got to speak truth into society? Us. It's little old us. It's the church.
It's the church.
And I think as I get older, and I've been in this sort of in the public space really since 1988, so a long time now. I'm quite a seasoned campaigner. I have found that it's not, the battle isn't necessarily hardest out there in the public sphere with those that do not know the Lord Jesus, but it's actually seeing a church that is large in number but seems to have no voice, that has a church that, yes, loves the Lord. I go to many churches where they love the Bible, they love the Lord Jesus, and they worship well, and I get flummoxed because I do not know how that doesn't translate into a vibrant community at the heart of our nation. Vibrant laws, fantastic laws that reflect the Lord Jesus Christ. Where is our voice? How come we've lost it? It's not as if we're few. It's not as if we're few. And, you know, I'm speaking to you on the day that Cameron announces that he is going to redefine marriage. He is issuing the legislation this very day, the day that I'm speaking to you. He's determined to do this. That is an affront to God. It turns God's laws up and down, upside down. And if we as God's people, if we the church cannot stop this legislation, then I almost have to ask, and forgive me if it's almost wrong to ask, whether we deserve to be saved from what will ensue. Now we long for every human being to know the Lord Jesus Christ. And we long for this nation to turn back to the Lord Jesus Christ. But actually, when we allow for legislation that so counteracts God's purposes at the heart of our nation, when we have a Prime Minister and a Cabinet that is determined despite opposition to continue, then we are in a very dark place in our nation.
Very dark place.
I do actually believe, I still believe, that the church is large enough in number to somehow stop this. I mean, how about a massive call to prayer? How about a massive call to come and march upon Westminster?
Yeah.
How about a no, Mr. Cameron, a no, Mr. Osborne, you cannot do this. We cannot be silent. And, you know, we, the church, must also remember this. It's not just on the marriage issue that we've been silent. We've been silent on the issue of life. Again, and we, as I sit talking to you, in the 45th year since the passing of the Abortion Act, 7.5 million abortions have taken place in England and Wales. We don't know how many embryos have been created or frozen, have been destroyed. This is catastrophic. It hurts. That's 7.5 million babies, human life. That's 7.5 women affected, 7.5 mums, 7.5 dads, 7.5 million lines interrupted, generational lines interrupted. What does God think? What does God think of this? So we have marriage, we have life. We have a push to legalise euthanasia, and we'll have that surely coming up in 2013. These are key abandonments of truth.
Yes. How can we stand up for our Christian beliefs in the workplace? It seems as though if we disagree with something, we disagree with an unbiblical work policy, we get penalised for doing so. How do we stand up for our Christian beliefs?
I'm all about encouraging Christians up and down the country to be fearless, to be bold, to speak of the Lord Jesus Christ as part of their life. You know that thing about not taking faith off, just not taking the faith off when you step outside of the door. But you know what? When we love Jesus, what does it mean about how we act? It means that we are the best we can be in Him by His grace. And we need to be fantastic workers. We need to be good employees. We need to be good bosses. And, you know, wouldn't it be fantastic if people think we just can't not employ these fantastic people because they are fantastic? But you know what? There will be occasions, and I think very often, just to say, I think very often companies recognise that Christians are great employees,
they do,
for instance. So I think that there's a lot of goodwill out there very often because we are. We're a good people. We want to do our best. Of course, that's true. But we must never. I think what we sometimes happen is that we become timid, and we are scared to assert truth. But what is actually really important is that we don't become fearful. So what's increasingly happening is that the Christians do become scared, perhaps to talking about Jesus, perhaps to talking about faith. You know, we have situations at the Christian Legal Centre where one of our cases, David Booker, he worked in a homeless shelter. He was there overnight. He was talking to his co-worker. They talked about life, the universe, and everything. They talked about the relationships, about sex within marriage. He said that he didn't believe that he believed that sex should only be within marriage, and that homosexual sex was wrong, and indeed all sex was wrong outside of marriage. That day when he returned, so he went home after his shift. When he returned back the following night for his shift, he was dismissed on the spot. And that was simply for talking, you know, this was literally over hot chocolate and digestive biscuits in the middle of the night. Now, I don't think that as a result of that kind of case, we should be scared about talking about biblical truths. You know, Dr. Scott, who was disciplined by the General Medical Council for talking about Jesus, he was warned. Why? For talking about Jesus. He said, I will never accept a warning on my professional record for talking about Jesus. Why did he talk about Jesus? Why? Because he sees thousands of patients every year. Why? Because he's seen tens of thousands of patients over the 30 years that he's been in general practice. Why? Because very often he's done a full medical examination and diagnosed the situation that the person is in. sometimes it's appropriate to talk to them about faith.
Absolutely.
To talk to them about Jesus.
Yeah.
It just comes out of Dr. Scott.
Yeah.
But he found himself penalised. Now, people like that should not be pushed out of the public square. And what I want to encourage Christians to do is to be like Dr. Scott. Because they can't push us all out.
No.
They can't push us all out of the public square. And so what we've got to do is stand firm and make sure that we don't see that people like... don't allow for people like Dr. Scott to become the eccentric fringe. Because let me tell you, he's not. He is so mainstream. He loves the Lord Jesus. He's absolutely mainstream. And that's why we, as a Christian body, have to come behind him. We have to come behind Caroline Petrie, the nurse that offered prayer and was suspended. Yeah. We have to come behind Olive Jones, the teacher that told her testimony and offered prayer and was sacked on the spot. We have to come behind Shirley Chaplin, the nurse that had worn her cross for over 30 years and was told to take it off. We have to come behind Duke of Macquarie, the homelessness prevention officer, who was suspended and then dismissed for gross misconduct because he offered the hope of healing to a woman who was terminally ill. We have to come behind these fantastic people and say these are people of faith who want to offer the hope that the Lord Jesus Christ brings, ultimately the only hope for us all.
So thank you, Andrea. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time out to be with us today. And now, if anyone watching would like to get involved with Christian Concern, would like to, you mentioned before about coming behind all of these people, would like to show their support to Christian Concern in the invaluable work that you have done in the past and continue to champion ahead with, how can they get involved?
Well, please join us. We would love for that to be the case. What we want to see in this nation, as I know that you do at The Way, is really just a vibrant Christian people who, at the touch, I always think just at the touch of a few buttons on the screen, as it were, that we can connect with one another. We know so that we know when things are breaking, when we know that we have to stand. That thousands upon thousands of us, people that really love the Lord Jesus, will be ready to act. And you can do that by just typing in www.christianconcern.com, Google us, Google Christian Concern, and find us and sign up. We have a weekly email.
And we can support the work that you do on your website as well by donating. But thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.